Welcome back, everyone. Now we're alone, I can make a slight admission, which is I'm not entirely happy with how I did structure last time. There's a problem with this, obviously, which is that informing people how to do structure can be a bit programmatic. You can end up forcing people into a sort of pigeonhole of how to arrange their essay, which doesn't always work that well. You know, you've got to try a few different ways and find out what works for you. So the goal today is to try to get to stage 4 of our research essay, which is of course editing. But last time we ended up talking a little bit about methodology. I used the example of feminism, and today I'm going to go into the literature review and talk about that for a little bit and articulate to you all how optional this stuff is, but why you might want to do it. So that's very much in the sort of structuring and drafting part. But very briefly, to start with, I want you to give me, not that you've got an option, because I'm just in an empty room here, you to give me another chance to talk to you about structure. So, method, lit review, and sort of 2.9 structure. Yeah. So the thing about structure is that it varies depending on what you're trying to accomplish in the essay, but there are a few general guidelines that are sufficiently powerful that I like to think of them as rules, but they're just not quite rules because you can break them. So what does structure refer to? Obviously it refers to the order of ideas in the essay and what form they take, so paragraphs and sections. So we all know the general structure of the essay: introduction, body paragraphs, conclusion. Last lecture I introduced the idea of having sections in an essay where you start to think about closer relationship between certain ideas in your essay than others, and you sort of put those into sections. And I also talked about starting out with a methodology, starting out with a description of your approach to the text and why you think it's going to be useful, and then doing a literature review, and then going on to the body paragraphs where you talk about your primary text or texts. So I'll do the literature review in a moment, but let's talk about some of these guidelines that are so good they're almost rules. The first is that because there's always too much to talk about, you want to do your most important things first. And by first, I mean both first in the essay, in terms of the order of your points, but also first in terms of how you think about your argument. You don't want to, it's so tempting to do this because this is how journalists do it a lot of the time, and it's also how TV shows work and a lot of cinema works and so much of our culture that we consume. It all builds to a crescendo, right? It starts off talking about little stuff, like Susan is at home doing nothing important, and then Susan finds out that everyone's an alien and she's the only human left alive, and that's the twist right up here. It builds to that crescendo. You don't want to do that with an academic essay. You want to do it the other way around. No one's left me an eraser here. You want to do it the other way around because don't leave your reader hanging. Don't leave them with any opportunity to suspect you don't know what you're talking about. I know when I grade an essay, as I'm reading it, I have an idea of what grade it's worth kind of at that time. With good reason. The introduction is the most important part of an essay, more or less. If you've got a methodology in a literature review, those kinds of things can indicate whether you've bothered to do any work or any serious intellectual thinking around your topic and argument. And if you, let's say we're only halfway through the essay, we're grading it. If after 2 or 3 body paragraphs, you haven't really said anything of great significance, you're just kind of fiddling around the edges, most of the time that indicates an essay that isn't focused enough. So when you're thinking about how do I structure my essay, how do I order my ideas, think about what your best ideas are. What are the most important ideas for your argument? What are the most important moments in the text for the argument? And also, because no matter what your argument is, no matter what your question you've chosen to answer is, every literature essay should be about how the book works in general. So think of the question as a starting point. It's a way into the text as a whole, but in general you should be aiming to take that direction. Let's say you're doing feminism in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Take that direction as a way in to talking about some of the most major events in the text, some of the most important ideas in the text. You know, if you're not doing that, really you're just fiddling around the edges of the text and not demonstrating your understanding of the text in general, but also probably not doing something that's that relevant to the text, right? Remember that example of feminism where I said that I love feminist readings, except when some bright spark decides to do a feminist reading of a text that's obviously totally sexist. Not only is there not much you can say, it's sexist, and then your reader's going to go, well, yeah, obviously. But you're probably not engaging with what the text does do, right? So it's not like what you're saying doesn't matter. It's important to call out sexism when we see it, but there probably isn't a 12-page research essay in calling, I don't know, pick your sexist text here, sexist. So when it comes to how to order your points, think about the most important things earlier in the essay. So that's the first guideline. Get your big guns out of the gate early, impress your reader, get straight to the heart of why your argument is so significant for understanding the text. But for that, right, you've got to get to the important parts in the text. Don't fiddle around on the margins. I'm sure some of you have already worked this out. There is a big exception to this, which is some essays rely on establishing certain things before they can really start to make the points they're trying to make. And I'm not just talking about if you're doing a feminist reading, you have to do a feminist methodology where you actually talk about what feminism is. I'm also talking about understanding how certain ideas in the text work for you, the critic, allow you to say other things about the text. So remember all that time on Virginia Woolf's Orlando. I hope it hasn't been too confusing. I guess it could be. I've tried to, at one and the same time, say how amazing the text is, but also how problematic it is. Amazing vis-a-vis the sort of progressive leadership on gender issues and time travel almost, like the plasticity of our understanding of history, but negative in the terms of its racism and classism. In some ways, those lectures are an example of what I'm talking about, that you have to establish certain things before you then go on to talk about other things. So with Woolf, if you were going to talk about how the representation of ethnicity works in the text, not very well, you kind of have to talk about some version of primitivism first. You have to establish credibly the possibility that talking about other cultures or ethnicities in a not immediately obviously negative way can still effectively be negative, or it can lead to negative things. So establish foundational ideas for your essay first. So that example there is primitivism, an analysis of primitivism moving to analysis of racism. So, two big rules. Sometimes these conflict, and that's fine. You've just got to find a balance. So last time I talked a little bit about Hegelian dialectics, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That can be a really powerful method if you're going to say something controversial, or at least something that you could imagine your reader, me, disagreeing with. what you never want to do is have a straw person argument, where an argument is something that can be debated. And really at the 3,000 and the 4,000 level, everyone here is an advanced student. And that means you have to do justice to opposing ideas or sort of potential counter ideas. So if you think your argument has a weakness to it, don't hide it, because I will see it, and you know it's there, and probably anyone else who reads it at the 3,000 or 4,000 level will notice that there's a weakness to your argument. Don't hide it, but actively talk about it. If you talk about the limitations of your argument, I'll be impressed, because I can see that you're being self-aware when you write the essay. So let's row back for a moment. One of the debates about Virginia Woolf is how much of a feminist is she, right? Because clearly Orlando is a feminist text, and quite a successful one. But her problems with the representations of class in all her novels, really, indicate that for some people, she might not be as feminist as others claim her to be. If working class women are included in her sort of gender androgyny utopia, how feminist can we say her to be? It's probably not really my place to impose that on you. You can probably guess where my feelings lie. But if you were to say that Virginia Woolf wasn't a particularly successful feminist, if that was your argument, because of the class and the ethnicity issues, you couldn't just say that. You would have to devote some time early in your essay to doing justice to the more successful parts of Virginia Woolf's feminism. So that would be a way in which the dialectical structure could work for you. Sorry, method lit review, you're getting boxed out for a moment. So dialectics, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? We make a claim that some people think Virginia Woolf's a feminist. You make the anti-claim, Virginia Woolf seems to be not that motivated in including working class women and women of colour. The black amour in her description in Orlando that we did, I guess, for me it's yesterday, for you it's like 2 weeks ago. Women of colour don't get included in her feminist utopia. So that means the synthesis has to be, she is somewhat of a feminist but not totally. And precisely where you land on that, like how fatal is her lack of inclusion of working class women and women of colour, that's kind of up to you. You've got to just read the novel thoroughly. So in order for this synthesis part to be successful, you have to do the thesis properly. You can't just go, let's say you don't think Virginia Woolf's a successful feminist. You can't set up a straw person argument here when you establish the alleged feminist credentials of the text. You have to do it properly. You can't just do it superficially and not take it seriously. This is where the literature review comes in, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So if you properly analyse the successfully feminist elements of the text, that then allows you to compare them credibly with the less successful parts. And that gives you evidence upon which to base your synthesis, right? But it also makes whatever your synthesis comes to be more credible because you've shown your work. So hopefully that makes sense. So I guess the final thing I want to say on structure is that hopefully you got last time with that somewhat free associative stuff about the spider diagrams, that you want your essay to be driven by the arrangement of ideas that you come up with, not just the order that the text presents them in. And when we talked about sections, we talked about certain ideas in your text are going to naturally fall into clusters that work together quite well. So you want to turn those into explicit or implicit sections. This can be especially important if you have multiple big ideas you want to talk about in the text, because that way certain big ideas and how they work are going to be best exemplified by certain kind of smaller moments. And so you can cluster all of those things together in section after section after section. But it's the relationships between the sections that are potentially most interesting there. So again, it kind of depends what you want to do with your essay, but view your structure as material, physical evidence that you can use to exemplify the relationships between ideas you're trying to claim in your argument. So I guess that's all I have to say about structure for now. So, the arrangement of an essay into introduction, methodology, literature review, and then the body of the essay is not mandatory. And this isn't something where the professor goes, oh, it's voluntary, but really it's not voluntary. It is voluntary. However, what is not voluntary is your attempts to solve the problems that structuring the essay in the way that I'm about to talk about helps you solve. So you all have a problem, which is that the majority of your time writing essays in high school and then at university has been doing biblically simple things without introducing any theory and philosophy, and most of the time no literary criticism either. Now, if you were a 4th or 5th or 6th year undergraduate student, this will apply less to you, but still it will only have been in the last 2 or 3 years that you've been introducing criticism and maybe theory into your essays. And your essays are getting longer. They're not 5 pages or 6 pages anymore. I mean, this time I'm asking for 12 pages. That should indicate that the level of complexity you're being asked to deal with is much greater now. And that is an issue if you try to structure your essays in the way that you're comfortable with, which is just doing everything in paragraphs. So that's the typical way, right? When I read a 3rd year essay from a strong student who might not necessarily have been trained in the way that I'm about to propose, here's how they do it. Intro, and then they have these like kind of big paragraphs, and by kind of I mean too big. And in them, I mean, the paragraphs tend to be well written and do a lot of things well, but they're so long and unwieldy because they have to have the topic sentence, introduce the evidence, analysis of evidence, and then they put criticism in as well. And then hopefully, if they're doing their job, this abstract student who doesn't exist, hopefully they've interpreted the criticism for their own purposes. They haven't just dropped the criticism in there like some kind of fancy turd. They've described how the criticism